I was on a remote worksite once, just me and 3 other guys for 6 weeks straight. No internet, terrible phone signal, same faces every morning. By week 4, when the supply truck driver showed up, a man none of us had ever met, we practically dragged him inside and wouldn't let him leave. We made him coffee, offered him lunch, asked him questions about absolutely nothing just to hear a new voice. He thought we were insane. We were just desperately lonely. That memory came back hard when I read Kir Bulychev's, which translates roughly to The Witch's Dungeon, though the title doesn't really capture what the book is about. It's actually about what happens to people when you put them somewhere far from home, and what happens when everything they trust suddenly vanishes. Bulychev wrote this in the Soviet Union, part of a long series about space exploration and alien planets. He wasn't trying to write literature with a capital L. He was writing adventure stories, the kind you'd read on a train or before bed. But buried inside these adventures are observations about people that hit harder than most serious fiction I've read. This particular book opens with a character named Andre Bruce arriving at a research station on an alien planet. The station has been there for 6 months studying local wildlife. And the book says this: the station had been on the planet for half a year already, and its workers were starved for new faces. Conrad hugged Andre for a long time, as if he'd found a lost brother. Think about that phrase, starved for new faces. Not hungry. Starved. These are scientists, professionals, people who chose this work knowing what it would be like. But human nature doesn't care about your career choices or your training. You can be the most dedicated researcher in the galaxy, and after 6 months of seeing the same 4 people every single day, a random visitor becomes the most important person in your world. You'll hug him like family. You'll invent reasons to keep him around longer. You'll talk his ear off about things that don't matter just to have a conversation that doesn't follow the same script you've been repeating for months. I've felt this. Not in space, obviously, but in situations where my world got small. And what strikes me about how Bulychev writes it is that he doesn't make it dramatic. He doesn't have the characters breaking down or going crazy. They're just human. They adapt. They make the best of it. And then when something new enters their environment, you see how much pressure they've been under the whole time. The station chief, Conrad, has adapted by rejecting comfort. He tells Andre, "We don't turn on the air conditioning. It's healthier this way, otherwise you get runny noses and colds. At night it gets cool here." This is a man on an alien planet with technology that could make his life easier, and he's chosen to live more like a camper than an astronaut. There's a philosophy in that choice. He's saying, if we make everything comfortable, we get weak. If we rely too much on our systems, we forget how to just exist in a place. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but I recognize the impulse. I knew a nurse once who refused to work in the newest, most climate-controlled hospital wing. She preferred the older section where the heating was inconsistent and you had to open windows. She said it kept her awake, kept her sharp. Maybe that's what Conrad is doing. Or maybe after 6 months of isolation, you start making these kinds of decisions because you need to feel like you're in control of something. The book is structured around a mystery. Andre visits the station, meets the crew, everything seems fine. The planet is harsh but manageable. There are dangerous animals, actual pterodactyls, which I'll get to in a minute, but the station has protocols. Then Andre leaves to go back to his ship. And after he's gone, the station goes silent. No communication. Nothing. When rescue teams finally arrive, the whole place has been destroyed by fire. Most of the crew is dead. Andre himself is missing, possibly dead, possibly wandering the wilderness. The book describes the rescue teams thinking before they land, even if by chance a fire had started in one of the tents, the automatic fire suppression systems should have put it out quickly. And it was hard to imagine such a sudden fire that it would prevent the station from contacting the ship. This is the paradox of safety systems. We build them to protect us from disaster. We test them. We trust them. And then when disaster actually happens, we can't believe it. We think, but we had systems for this. We had backups. How could this go wrong? Anyone who's worked in a place with safety protocols knows this feeling. You do the training. You check the equipment. You follow the procedures. And then one day something happens that wasn't in the manual, or multiple small failures line up in exactly the wrong way, and suddenly all your preparation means nothing. The book doesn't explain right away what went wrong at the station. It lets you sit with that uncertainty, that feeling of, this shouldn't have been possible. There's a cruel irony in how Andrei ended up on the planet at all. The book says, when he offered to go down to the planet, substituting for the navigator, the captain of the ship was happy to do Andrei this favor. But now it turned out that this favor might have turned into disaster for Andrei. The captain thought he was being nice. Andrei was bored on the ship, wanted to see the planet, so the captain bent the rules and let him go. A small kindness. The kind of thing a decent boss does for someone under his command. And now Andrei might be dead because of it. I think about this whenever I do someone a favor that involves any kind of risk. You let someone borrow your car, they get in an accident. You recommend someone for a job, the company goes under. You invite someone to an event, they meet someone who ruins their life. You can't live in fear of these possibilities, or you'd never do anything kind for anyone. But the weight of it is real. The captain gave Andrei permission to leave the ship, and now he has to live with whatever happened to him. Before the disaster, Andrei spends time at the station, and the book describes the landscape. It was a hot, windless day, grasshoppers chirped and birds sang deafeningly. The steppe had already finished blooming, but the grass hadn't yet yellowed and gave off heavy, moist smells. This is the kind of detail that plants itself in your memory. Beautiful weather. Peace. The smell of grass. And we know, because we're reading forward, that soon this peaceful place will be a scene of death and fire. That contrast between the calm before and the catastrophe after is something Bulychev uses quietly but effectively. He's not hitting you over the head with foreboding music and dark clouds. He's showing you a nice day. Which makes what comes next feel more real, because disasters don't wait for ominous weather. They happen on ordinary afternoons when grasshoppers are chirping. Conrad walks Andrei around the station, showing him the local wildlife. There are these pterodactyl-like creatures, flying reptiles that shouldn't exist but do on this weird planet. And Conrad says, casually, want to take a look? Just don't get too close, they have teeth. He's offering to show Andrei something dangerous the way you might offer someone a look at a beehive or a snake you found. It's routine for him. He's been here 6 months. He's seen these creatures every day. The danger is still real, but it's become familiar. That's what happens when you work in hazardous conditions long enough. You don't stop recognizing the danger, but you stop feeling it the same way. It becomes part of the landscape. I've seen this in every dangerous job I've encountered. The construction workers who walk beams stories high. The factory workers around heavy machinery. The drivers on mountain roads in bad weather. At first, your body screams at you to be careful. After enough time, you're eating a sandwich with one hand while doing the dangerous thing with the other. It's adaptation. It's also how people die. Conrad offering to show Andrei the pterodactyls like they're pigeons, it's such a small moment, but it tells you everything about what living on this planet has done to these people's sense of normalcy. The survivors from the destroyed station get rescued and transferred to another research outpost on the same planet. And here's where Bulychev does something that I love. He drops us into the middle of a completely different situation, with different people, different problems. We're not following one clean storyline. We're seeing snapshots of what happens when advanced humans try to study a world where evolution doesn't follow the rules. This new station is studying primitive humans. Not metaphorically primitive. Actually primitive. People who hunt with spears, who haven't invented agriculture yet, who live in tribes and fight over territory. Except they share this world with dinosaurs. Pterodactyls fly overhead. Stegosaurs pull loads like oxen. Evolution on this planet kept everything, the ancient and the new, all jumbled together. Bulychev has one of the scientists say it plainly. Why is everything so illogical? The laws of evolution are constant. One thing dies out, makes way for another. Here, nothing made way. This isn't just strange biology. It's Bulychev pointing out that progress isn't inevitable. That history doesn't have to move in one direction. That the neat stories we tell ourselves about how civilizations develop, they're just stories. At this station, there's a girl from one of the local tribes. They call her Bulychev. She's maybe 16, 17. Smart. Curious. She's been hanging around the researchers, learning their language, asking questions. The scientists are fascinated by her, the way you'd be fascinated by any intelligent person trapped in circumstances beyond their control. One of the researchers mentions casually that a boy from another tribe tried to steal from them. He's disappointed he couldn't grab a shiny metal box. They're terrible thieves, the researcher says. Then he adds, Bulychev told him, taking what belongs to others is bad. I read that line and had to stop. Read it again. Because here's what's happening. For Bulychev's people, stealing from strangers isn't wrong. It's normal. It's expected. These researchers are from another tribe, a weird tribe with magic tools and strange customs, but still just another tribe. Taking things from other tribes is what you do. It's how you survive. But Bulychev has been learning their language. And with the language, she's absorbing their moral framework. She's starting to think that taking things without permission is bad, not just bad for their tribe, but bad in itself. She's internalizing the ethics of people who live in a world of laws and property rights, even though she lives in a world where those concepts don't exist yet. This happens all the time, of course. You grow up in one environment with one set of rules, then you meet people with different rules. If you spend enough time with them, if you learn to speak their language fluently, their way of seeing the world starts to become your way. You can see it with immigrants, with people who move between social classes, with anyone who crosses a cultural boundary and stays there long enough. What makes it tragic here is that Bulychev can't actually live in both worlds. She's learning to think like the researchers, but she's not one of them. She's stuck in her tribe, with their rules, their dangers, their limitations. She's becoming someone who doesn't quite fit anywhere. The researchers find her interesting for another reason too. One of them, a ship captain named Andrei, walks past her with another scientist. She watches them go. When Andrei turns back to look at her, she shouts, "You're beautiful." Just like that. Direct. No games, no pretending she wasn't looking. One of the scientists laughs and says, "Why is it that everywhere in the universe, space fleet captains are so popular with girls?" He's joking, but he's also making a point. It used to be hussars, he says. The cavalry officers in fancy uniforms. Now it's starship captains. But the pattern is the same: women are attracted to men with status and position, across cultures, across centuries, apparently across planets. You can debate whether that's biology or social conditioning. You can argue about whether it's good or bad. But Bulychev isn't making a judgment here. He's just observing. This is how humans work. Even when you strip away everything, cities, technology, complex social structures, this remains. Then the conversation turns darker. They're talking about a local warlord named Oktinkish. The name is clearly meant to echo Attila the Hun. This guy leads a large war band. He conquers other tribes, takes their territory, takes their women, kills anyone who resists. One of the scientists, Conord, says he's a smart man. I talked to him. He understands his historical task. Another scientist, Ingrid, responds with barely controlled fury, "If your historical task is to rob and kill, it's not hard to understand it." This is the argument that won't die. Every time there's a conqueror, a strongman, someone who uses violence to build power, there are people who say, "Yes, but look at the bigger picture. Look at what they're building. They're unifying tribes. They're creating order. They're fulfilling a historical role. You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs." And then there are people like Ingrid who say, "No. He's just a murderer." The fact that he murders a lot of people and takes a lot of territory doesn't make him a historical figure. It makes him a successful murderer. Bulychev was writing this in the Soviet Union. He grew up in a country where the official history was full of historical tasks and historical necessity. Stalin's purges killed millions, but they were necessary to defend socialism. Forced collectivization caused famine, but it was necessary for industrialization. Every atrocity came with an explanation about historical inevitability. So when Conrad talks about Aktinkish's historical task, and Ingrid shoots back that any bandit can claim they're serving history, Bulychev is doing what he always does. He's setting the argument on an alien planet so he can talk about Earth. Bela Guraka has her own history with Aktinkish. She was engaged to a boy from another tribe. The marriages were arranged when they were children, the way these things worked. But Aktinkish's warriors attacked the tribe and killed everyone. The boy died. The entire group was wiped out. Now Bela Guraka is considered a widow, even though she was never married. A girl widow, one researcher explains. It's considered a defect. She lost her future husband before she ever really knew him. And in her tribe's eyes, this makes her damaged goods. No one else will want to marry her now, because she was promised to someone who died. It doesn't matter that it wasn't her fault. The social rules are rigid. Her life trajectory just got narrower. I thought about this for a long time. How many people have their lives defined by things that happened to them, things they didn't choose and couldn't control? You were born in the wrong place. You got sick at the wrong time. Someone you were connected to died or failed or got caught doing something wrong. And now that's part of your story, part of how people see you. A mark you can't erase. Bela Guraka is smart enough and curious enough that she might have been something different. But she's a girl widow in a primitive tribe on a planet that evolution forgot to organize properly. The researchers will eventually leave. She'll still be there, carrying her unmarried widowhood like a stone in her pocket. Conrad calls a meeting with Aktinkish. He wants to show this primitive warlord what real civilization looks like. So they prepare the station, all gleaming surfaces and soft lighting, the kind of environment that makes you feel like you're standing inside the future itself. Conrad expects Aktinkish to walk in, see the technology, understand the gap between them, and naturally accept that these people from the stars are superior. That he should listen, learn, maybe even submit a little to their authority. It's the same assumption empires have made forever. We have better weapons, better tools, better knowledge, therefore we are better, and any reasonable person will see that. The powerful always think their power is self-evident. Bela Guraka wants to come to the meeting. She's practically begging for it. And here's something that caught my attention, the way Bulychev shows you exactly what a child feels when someone has hurt them. She says, let Aktinkish see that I have big friends now, and then we'll go on a campaign and kill him. It's so pure, that child logic. She doesn't just want to be safe. She wants the person who scared her to know she's protected now. She wants to stand there with powerful adults at her back and watch his face when he realizes she's not alone anymore. Anyone who was bullied as a kid knows this fantasy. You don't just want the bully to stop. You want them to see you walking with someone bigger, stronger, someone who makes them hesitate. You want that moment of recognition. So Aktinkish arrives. And immediately everything Conrad planned starts falling apart. Aktinkish turns out to be so primitive that the elegant interiors of the station and Conrad's power, his ability to light a sun overhead, none of it impresses him. He doesn't want to bow to Conrad at all. He sees in Conrad a steppe chieftain, just as treacherous and petty as Aktinkish himself. That's the line that made me stop reading. Conrad can literally create light out of nothing from Aktinkish's perspective. He lives in a structure that by all rights should look like a palace of the gods. But Aktinkish walks in and sees just another guy trying to dominate him. He's not intimidated. He's evaluating. Because power doesn't translate across cultures the way we think it does. What Conrad considers obviously superior, technology and science and progress, Aktinkish doesn't value. He values different things. Strength, cunning, the ability to take what you want and hold it. Conrad's technology is just another tool, like a better sword or a faster horse. It doesn't make Conrad worthy of respect. It just makes him potentially dangerous. This happens all the time in real life. A manager with an advanced degree assumes workers will naturally defer to her education. A city official assumes rural people will be grateful for development projects they never asked for. Someone from a wealthy country assumes their way of organizing society is obviously better, and anyone who doesn't immediately adopt it is just stubborn or stupid. But Aktinkish isn't stupid. He's operating by different rules that have kept him alive and in power in a world where dinosaurs can eat you and neighboring tribes can slaughter your family. Those rules work. Why would he abandon them? Conrad tries to negotiate. There's a woman, part of this whole complicated situation, and Conrad asks if she agrees to whatever arrangement Aktinkish is proposing. And Aktinkish is genuinely baffled. She agrees? You ask the desire of a little woman? That's how it's done among you? He's not being cruel in his own mind. He's pointing out what seems obvious to him, the natural order of things. Why would you ask a woman's opinion about her own life? That's not how his world works. Women don't have that kind of agency in his society. Asking them would be like asking a child to decide complex political matters. It would be absurd. And Conrad is sitting there realizing that all his assumptions about universal human values, about consent and individual autonomy, they're not universal at all. They're his values, from his culture, and this man in front of him doesn't share them. You can't just explain your way out of that gap. You can't give a TED talk about human rights and expect someone to suddenly restructure their entire worldview. The conversation keeps going, getting more uncomfortable. Conrad talks about iron, about metallurgy. He's trying to explain that iron is for building things, for making tools, for plowing fields and creating useful objects. But Aktinkish just states flatly, iron is for conquest. Iron is needed to build an extract or, to plow fields, to make useful things, Conrad says. And Aktinkish responds, iron is needed to conquer. The elders around Aktinkish nod. This young chief understands things. He speaks wisdom. And from their perspective, he does. What use is iron if not to make weapons? What use are weapons if not to take what you want from people weaker than you? That's the logic of their world, and it's internally consistent. I thought about this exchange for a long time after I read it. We live in a world where most people never think about where their iPhone comes from, what violence and exploitation went into the coltan mines that produced the minerals inside it. We like to think we've moved past Aktinkish's worldview. But have we? Or have we just gotten better at hiding the violence under layers of complexity, supply chains and corporate structures and international trade agreements? Andre is watching this whole negotiation, and he sees something Conrad doesn't. He's testing you, Andre says. As soon as you give in on something, he'll immediately take a step forward. It's a negotiation tactic as old as human interaction. You make a demand. You watch how the other person responds. If they give you what you want too easily, you know they're weak, and you demand more. You keep pushing until you find resistance. That's how you map the boundaries of what you can take. Every used car salesman knows this. Every 5-year-old knows this. You ask for dessert before dinner. If mom says yes immediately, you ask for 2 desserts. If she hesitates, you know you can probably negotiate screen time instead. Aktinkish is doing the same thing, just with higher stakes. But then something interesting happens. Aktinkish pulls out a knife. Not to threaten anyone, just to show it off, maybe to trade. And Andre looks at it and his whole understanding shifts. He understood that the blade was based on a factory-rolled strip of steel, which was then cut into pieces and sharpened. Of course, no one here knows how to smelt iron yet, much less steel. But somehow real steel ended up in Aktinkish's hands. This is wrong. This shouldn't exist. They're dealing with what they thought was a primitive society, pre-industrial, maybe early Bronze Age at most. But here's factory-made steel. Machine-rolled. Industrial. Someone gave them this. Or they found it. Or there's a whole other layer to this planet's situation that nobody understands yet. It's like finding a smartphone in a Viking burial mound. Not something similar, not a primitive version, but an actual smartphone. It breaks the timeline. It means your entire framework for understanding what's happening is incomplete. And there's another detail Andrei notices. When Aktinkish hands out these knives, he doesn't give one to Conrad first. He gives it to Andrei. He considered Andrei a more important chief than Conrad. Aktinkish has been watching. He's seen how people interact, who defers to whom, where the real power sits. Conrad might be doing all the talking, but Andrei is the one people glance at before making decisions. Aktinkish caught that. He's reading the room better than the technologically advanced people think he can. There's a moment where they try to get Aktinkish to sit in a chair. He's never seen furniture like this before. And suddenly, with a quick monkey-like movement, Aktinkish jumped up and settled into the chair with his legs folded. His companions greeted this achievement with loud exclamations. He figures it out. But he does it his own way. He sits cross-legged like he's at a campfire, not with his feet on the floor like Conrad sits. He's adapting to the new situation while maintaining his own dignity and style. He's not imitating. He's incorporating. I've seen this exact thing happen with my grandfather, who grew up in a village and later moved to the city. He learned to use modern things, but always in his own way. He'd answer his cell phone by shouting into it like it was a bad radio. He'd wear a suit jacket over his traditional shirt. He wasn't confused. He was just maintaining who he was while engaging with something new. The meeting ends with Aktinkish demanding that any food they send to his camp has to be checked by his shaman first. My shaman must purify it, because your people might have spoiled it. Poisoning. He assumes they'll try to poison him. Not because he has evidence, but because that's what people do. That's how power works in his experience. You smile, you negotiate, and then you poison the wine. He lives in a world where trust gets you killed. And maybe he's not wrong to think that way. Maybe in his world, with his enemies, suspicion is what keeps you alive. The negotiation fails, as everyone probably could have predicted. Conrad and his team are captured and taken as slaves. And this is where Bulychev does something I didn't expect the first time I read this. He doesn't write an escape scene. He doesn't give us the adventure novel moment where the heroes break free in chapter 2. Instead, he makes them sit in it. Be captive. Experience what it actually means to lose everything: freedom, status, dignity, in a single afternoon. There's a conversation between the prisoners that stopped me cold when I first read it. Andrei, one of the captured cosmonauts, is trying to convince Axel, a geneticist, to eat the disgusting slop the tribe has given them. Axel refuses. He's holding on to something, some last piece of himself. Andrei tells him flat out, being proud is honorable, but it's more useful to stay alive. I remember reading that line on a bus coming home from work. I was maybe 23, working a job I hated, and I'd been telling myself I should quit, that staying was beneath me somehow. That line hit different in that moment. Bulychev wasn't writing about pride as this noble thing. He was writing about pride as a luxury you might not be able to afford. But here's what makes this scene sharper. Andrei isn't just saying, swallow your pride and survive. He's making a more disturbing point. He tells Axel, we exist in different worlds with them, worlds that only touch at the edges, and you're trying to impose your own psychology on them. Read that again. They're prisoners of people who might kill them tomorrow, and Andrei is saying, don't judge them by our moral standards. They operate in a completely different mental framework. It's not that they're evil by nature. They're playing a different game with different rules, and getting angry about it is like getting angry at weather. I've thought about that line a lot over the years. How many times have you been furious at someone, a boss, a bureaucrat, a family member, because they weren't following rules that were obvious to you? And how many times did you later realize they were playing an entirely different game, where your rules didn't even exist? But Axel can't hear this. And Bulychev tells us why in one devastating sentence, the qualified geneticist Nadezhda suddenly found himself a slave of some wild tribe. This change in status was unbearable for Axel. Not the danger. Not the hunger. Not even the captivity itself. The loss of status. The sudden transformation from respected professional to nobody. I've seen this break people in real life. A manager who gets demoted. A professor who retires and nobody calls anymore. An athlete whose body gives out. The psychological wound of going from somebody to nobody can be deeper than physical harm. There's another character in this scene, Jean, and he jumps into the argument with the most disturbing philosophical position yet. They're discussing whether they should try to kill the tribal leader, Aktinkish. Axel argues they should. He's dangerous, he'll kill thousands more people if he keeps consolidating power. And Jean says, if he wasn't born, another would be born. This is historical determinism stated as cold fact. The idea that evil leaders aren't aberrations but inevitable products of their time and conditions. That if you somehow went back and prevented Hitler's birth, you'd just get a different Hitler, because the circumstances that created Hitler would still exist. I don't know if I believe this. But I know it's a more terrifying thought than simple individual evil, because if it's true, there's no easy solution. You can't just remove the bad guy. You have to change the entire system that produces bad guys. Then the conversation takes an even darker turn. Axel reveals what he actually thinks should be done with primitive civilizations. He talks about taking their children, raising them properly, training the adults like you train animals. Andrei responds with bitter sarcasm, so you're a humane trainer. This stopped me because Bulychev published this in the Soviet Union in the 1990s, but he's writing about the exact logic of colonialism. The civilizing mission. The idea that advanced societies have not just the right but the duty to uplift backward ones. And he's showing you, through Axel, how quickly uplifting becomes controlling becomes. Maybe we should just eliminate the adults and start fresh with the children. The book gives you the actual quote, so, humane training with nurseries for children. But is it worth the trouble? Maybe liquidate the adults? Liquidate. That clean bureaucratic word. I work in systems now, I see how language works in institutions. Nobody ever says kill. They say eliminate, liquidate, let go, downsize, neutralize. The distance the word creates from the action is the distance that lets you do terrible things while still thinking of yourself as reasonable. Bulychev is doing something here that most adventure novels don't do. He's trapped his heroes, yes. But more than that, he's trapping them with each other, forcing them to reveal their actual philosophies under pressure. And some of those philosophies are ugly. These aren't just good guys captured by bad guys. These are people with different and sometimes incompatible visions of how civilization should work, and captivity is stripping away the polite coding. Meanwhile, while they're arguing philosophy, they're still prisoners who need to survive. And Bulychev shows you how humans actually cope. Andrei makes jokes. Axel asks him, why are you joking? Is this the time for jokes? And Andrei answers, it's always time for jokes. I've known people like this. People who crack wise at funerals, who make dark jokes in hospital waiting rooms. It used to bother me when I was younger. It seemed disrespectful. Now I understand it's a survival mechanism. Humor creates distance. Distance creates space to think. If you're drowning in fear every second, you can't function. The joke isn't disrespect. The joke is what lets you keep breathing. The tribe holds some kind of ritual with a dinosaur heart. The prisoners watch, trying to understand. One of them says, it's hard to get used to. The other responds, why get used to it? I don't want to live out my years as Aktinkish's slave. That small exchange contains the whole psychological split of captivity. Do you adapt or do you resist? If you adapt too much, you risk losing yourself. If you resist too much, you risk not surviving. There's no good answer. Just the grinding daily choice between two bad options. Cut to the spaceship orbiting above. The duty officer is watching through sensors. He can see everything from up there. The riders, the camp, the whole sweep of the plane. And Bulychev gives him this thought, I see these people from a height unimaginable to them. For me they're dots. Little ants in the dark endlessness of the steppe. But each of them is a separate world. I had to stop reading when I hit that paragraph. Just sit with it. because it's the fundamental problem of empathy at scale. When you're far enough away, suffering becomes abstract. Numbers. Statistics. Dots on a map. But each dot is a person with the same inner complexity you have. The same fears and hopes and memories. Distance doesn't actually change that. It just makes it easier to forget. And then Bulychev gives you the flip side through Jean's thoughts. Jean was afraid. He had never in his life been alone among people who didn't care whether he lived or died. That might be the most primal fear in the book. Not physical danger. Not pain. But being surrounded by human faces that look at you with complete indifference. It's worse than being alone in wilderness. It's the horror of being alone among people. Of existing in a space where your death would be met with a shrug. There's a moment when Andrei is riding through the steppe, trying to escape, and Bulychev gives you this detail that just cuts through everything. Andrei desperately wants to get off the horse. His whole body is screaming at him. He's not made for horseback riding. But there's a girl next to him, Bella, and he can't bring himself to admit it. He'd rather suffer than look weak in front of her. And the book just states this plainly. This is the kind of thing Bulychev does throughout the book. He'll be writing about space explorers and ancient civilizations, about political intrigue and survival, but then he'll drop in something so human and ordinary that you just start laughing. Here's a guy running for his life, part of a desperate escape, and what's actually bothering him most? His sore butt and his male ego. It's ridiculous. And it's completely real. I've been that person. Not running from tribal warriors, but sitting in a meeting when my back is killing me, when I need to use the bathroom, when I'm exhausted, and I just keep sitting there because admitting it feels like admitting weakness. We do this all the time. We'll endure actual physical pain rather than lose face. And in Andrei's case, this stupid masculine pride could actually get him killed. He might fall off the horse from exhaustion because he was too embarrassed to say he needed a break. But there's something else happening in this scene that's even more interesting. While they're riding, Andrei mentions something about being scanned from a ship. He says, "Think about what that means. This is a man from an advanced spacefaring civilization. He came here to explore, to study, to understand this world. And he's become so absorbed into the local culture, so completely adapted, that even his own people scanning from orbit can't distinguish him from the natives. He's disappeared into the society he was supposed to be observing. He's lost contact with his own civilization. Is this success or failure? On one hand, he's achieved perfect camouflage, complete integration. An anthropologist's dream. On the other hand, he's become invisible even to his rescuers. He's stranded not because he can't be found, but because there's nothing about him left to find. He looks like everyone else. I think about this with immigration, with assimilation. How much of yourself do you keep? At what point does adaptation become erasure? There are people who move to a new country, learn the language perfectly, adopt all the customs, and then one day they wake up and realize their own children don't understand where they came from. They succeeded so well at fitting in that they disappeared. And the world Andrei has adapted to is more complex than it first appears. These aren't simple nomads. Bulychev shows you that even in what looks like a primitive steppe society, there are layers of political maneuvering that would make a modern diplomat sweat. Someone named Octanhash has broken a peace agreement. Treaties have been violated. Alliances are shifting. Bella explains it simply. It sounds basic when she says it like that. But think about what it implies. This society has formal peace agreements. They have alliance structures. They understand the concept of friends of friends. These are not primitive political concepts. These are the same mechanisms that drive international relations today. The same logic that starts wars in our world. Bulychev is showing you that human conflict, human politics, doesn't require technology or civilization. It's baked into us. But where the book gets really fascinating is in how Bella herself thinks and operates. At one point, Andrei almost laughs at something she does, and she threatens to kill him. not because it hurts her feelings. She explains. She doesn't care if he thinks she's funny. She cares that the spirits will see someone laughing at the chief's daughter, and that brings shame to her tribe. Honor isn't personal for her. It's structural. It's about position in a network of relationships that includes not just the living but the supernatural. Being laughed at isn't an insult to her ego, it's a violation of cosmic order. This is so foreign to how most of us think now. We're taught that what matters is how we feel about ourselves. That other people's opinions shouldn't affect us. But for Bela Guraka, other people's opinions and the spirit's opinions are the only thing that matters. There is no self separate from how you're perceived. And she operates with this kind of brutal efficiency in other ways too. At one point she tells Andre her brother is dead. Just states it. He's gone. He went there. No tears, no breakdown, no visible grief. Just fact. Andre asks her how she knows, and she tells him she hears things. Not with her ears, though. She points to her chest. She shows her heart. Then her ear. She hears with both. She knows her brother is dead the way you know when you walk into your house that something is wrong even though you can't point to what it is. Intuition that feels physical. My grandmother was like this. She'd know someone was sick before the phone rang. She'd wake up in the middle of the night and say someone had died, and the next morning we'd find out it was true. We called it intuition, or coincidence, or selective memory. But what if it's just that she was paying attention to signals most of us ignore? What if Bela Guraka has trained herself to notice everything: wind patterns, animal behavior, tiny changes in sound, and her brain processes it as feeling rather than thinking? Throughout the escape, Bela Guraka keeps assuming things that are obvious to her must be obvious to Andre. She says, "It's clear. Why doesn't he understand?" Bulychev writes, "For some reason she believed what was clear to her should be clear to Andre." This happens in every relationship, every workplace, every cultural encounter. You explain something and the other person just stares at you. How can they not get it? It's so obvious. But obvious is cultural. Obvious is learned. What's self-evident in one world is incomprehensible in another. At one point Andre is too nervous to eat because they're being chased, and Bela Guraka basically tells him to man up. You're a man, you shouldn't be afraid. She's using gender as a teaching tool. Courage isn't optional for men in her world, it's definitional. If you're afraid, you're not properly male. It works, too. Andre eats. Not because he suddenly feels brave, but because the social pressure is more uncomfortable than the fear. Which tells you something about how these codes function. They're not about how you feel inside. They're about what you do despite how you feel. And Bela Guraka is smart. Really smart. Not in the way Andre is smart, he has education, technology, scientific knowledge. She has something else. She knows how to wait for the right moment. When they're being chased along a river, she doesn't panic. She doesn't try to fight. She waits because she knows something about this river. Every morning at dawn, a tidal wave comes through. Everyone knows this. It's part of the landscape. So she waits. And the wave comes. And it sweeps away one of their pursuers. And she laughs. Just laughs at his death. Andre is horrified, and she says simply, "He was an enemy." That's the whole explanation. That's all the justification needed. This is tribal morality in its purest form. There's us and there's them. What happens to them doesn't count the same way. Their death can be funny because they exist outside the circle of moral concern. It's not cruelty, exactly. It's just how the categories work. They're riding through landscape that shouldn't exist. Not metaphorically. Literally. Andre finds metal spheres in a cracked road, perfectly smooth, completely immune to corrosion. The book says, even the most skilled blacksmith couldn't forge or cast such a sphere. These are ball bearings. Industrial components. Sitting in a world where people hunt with spears and follow herds. I used to work in a machine shop one summer during university. We had a quality control station where they'd check bearing tolerances with micrometers. Perfect spheres are harder to make than you'd think. Even a variation of a few microns affects how something rolls. These things Andre finds are perfect. Which means somewhere in this planet's past, there were factories, precision manufacturing, probably computers to control the machining process. And now there are people who can't imagine why anyone would build a house from stone. Bulychev asks him, "Why would you build a house from stone? How would you move it when you need to follow the herds?" She's not being rhetorical. She genuinely cannot conceive of staying in one place. Because in winter, when the animals migrate south, when snow covers everything, you'd starve if you stayed put. Her logic is perfect. For her world. For survival. But it's the logic of someone whose entire civilization has forgotten that humans once lived differently. This is what Bulychev does that hits me every time I reread this book. He's not writing about some distant alien world. He's writing about what happens when collapse is so complete that the evidence of what came before becomes literally incomprehensible. Bulychev sees the metal spheres. She sees the roads. There's a gorge they pass that's described as perfectly straight. Not even the slightest imperfection that nature can't avoid, which is why you can see from one end to the other. That's not a natural formation. That's engineering. But to her, it's just something the old people made. Not ancestors she could learn from. Just old people. Like saying, it's always been there. I think about this whenever I use something I don't understand. I type on this keyboard without knowing exactly how the Bluetooth protocol works. I take antibiotics without being able to synthesize them. Most of us live surrounded by technology we can't reproduce. We're one or two catastrophes away from being Bulychev, looking at the remnants and just shrugging. The old people made it. But here's what makes the book more than just post-apocalyptic scenery. Bulychev uses this setting to show how people think when they live by instinct instead of analysis. There's a moment when Bulychev just stops and says she doesn't like something. Andre asks what she doesn't like. Just don't like it, that's all. She can't articulate why. She feels danger the way you feel a storm coming. No reasoning. No evidence. Just knowledge in her body. I used to dismiss this kind of thinking. I was trained in analysis, in breaking down arguments, in asking for evidence. Then I started paying attention to when I ignored my gut and regretted it. That job that looked perfect on paper but something felt off in the interview. The relationship where I could list all the reasons it should work while my body was tense every time we made plans. Bulychev isn't less intelligent than Andre. She's using a different intelligence, one that kept humans alive for hundreds of thousands of years before we invented logic. And then Bulychev shows you the cost of both kinds of thinking. Andre realizes that his escape has put Jean in danger. Turns out his freedom threatens Jean's life. Damn this planet. That's the moral complexity that shows up in Soviet science fiction that I rarely find in Western space adventures from the same era. Your individual freedom endangers someone else. Not because anyone is evil. Just because that's how this world works. In a society barely surviving, everyone is connected. Your choice ripples. There's a moment where Andre gets separated from Bulychev in tall grass and realizes he might be lost forever. He starts to panic. Then he stops. Forces himself to count to 100. 100. After counting to 100 and hearing nothing, Andre moved forward. This is such a small detail, but it's completely real. When you're overwhelmed, when fear is shutting down your thinking, sometimes the only thing you can do is count. Not because counting solves anything. Because it gives your rational mind something to hold on to while the panic passes. I've used this. Sitting in a car after a meeting where I got news that felt like the floor dropping out. Couldn't drive yet because I couldn't think. Counted to 100. Then I could turn the key. Bulychev doesn't make a big deal of it. Andrei just does it. But it's the kind of practical survival knowledge that actually works. Then he has to deal with a hostile warrior. He thinks. Need to act differently than the warrior expects. This is psychological warfare at its simplest. Your enemy has a script in his head. He expects you to run or fight or beg. Do something else and you break his script? You create a moment of confusion. That moment might be enough. And Bulychev gives you the specific technique. When Andrei grabs the warrior's spear, he pulls twice. First time so the warrior grips harder, afraid of losing the spear. Second time Andrei pulls with all his strength. You use their instinct against them. They hold tighter, you use that tightness. It's the same principle as Aikido. But Andrei isn't a martial artist. He's just thinking clearly under pressure. After they escape, they stop to drink. Bulychev explains the order. First horses, they can't get water themselves. Then men, they can't endure. Then women. Each level is based on different logic. Horses lack ability. Men lack self-control. Women can endure the most. Andrei lets her drink first. She's surprised. Is she his woman? Yes. Is he kind to her? It's his custom. I love this moment because it shows how kindness can exist across completely different moral systems. She's not expecting equality. She's expecting the hierarchy her culture taught her. But he acts according to his own code, and she recognizes it as kindness even though it breaks her rules. They're building something new between them. Not by abandoning their cultures but by choosing which parts to keep. Then Bulychev gets captured and wounded. When she escapes and hunts down her attacker, her eyes glow yellow like a cat's. After she kills him, she wipes the blood off her spear with grass and moves on. Casual. Normal. And she tells Andrei, "You're a real warrior. I'm proud to have such a man." His worth to her is entirely about his fighting ability. Because in her world, that's what keeps you both alive. The book isn't judging this. It's not saying primitive is better or worse. It's showing you what survival requires when the infrastructure collapses, when there's no police or hospitals or stores. You protect yourself or you die. Bulychev is exhausted but she tells Andrei she's amazed how strong he is. He's also exhausted but hearing her say that makes him feel proud anyway. They're both barely functioning but they recognize each other's effort. That recognition matters more than comfort. So Andrei and Bulychev escape the cave. They've nearly died together, spent the night huddled for warmth. And Bulychev does something interesting here. He describes their physical closeness in a way that's completely matter of fact. Her hand on his chest. Her head on his shoulder. It's not romantic. It's not sexual. It's just what happens when two bodies barely survived and need to share heat in the dark. I've thought about this scene a lot. Because most writers would frame this differently. They'd either make it romantic, full of tension and longing, or they'd make it awkward, full of embarrassment and careful distance. Bulychev does neither. He presents it as a simple fact, two mammals keeping each other alive. There's a specific moment that captures this. Bulychev's light, part palm rests on his chest. Then she turns, getting comfortable, and puts her head on his shoulder. That word, settling in more comfortably, it's what you'd do arranging a pillow. Practical. The intimacy here is born from shared survival, not from desire. It's the intimacy of soldiers in a foxhole, of climbers roped together on a mountain face. And just before she falls asleep, she mentions casually, all the food disappeared with the horses. Just like that. The horses are gone, all their supplies are gone, and she states it with the same tone you might use to mention it's raining. Then she's asleep. This stopped me. Because think about what that loss means. They're in hostile territory with no food, no transport, no supplies. This is life-threatening. But Bulychev's relationship to scarcity is completely different from what someone from an abundant civilization would have. She doesn't panic. She doesn't despair. She just notes the fact and goes to sleep because there's nothing to be done about it in the dark. I grew up in the Soviet Union during the late 80s, early 90s. I remember my grandmother's relationship to food, to things. She never threw anything away. A piece of string got saved. Bread that went hard got turned into something else. It wasn't anxiety exactly. It was just how you lived when scarcity was normal. Belogoraka has this same quality, but more intense. Loss is just part of the environment, like weather. When morning comes, there's another moment that Bulychev describes with that same matter-of-fact tone. Andrei is freezing. Belogoraka takes off her clothes and covers him with them. She does this completely unself-consciously. And the narrator observes, she was completely unashamed of her nakedness, and therefore there was no nakedness, just as a deer has no nakedness. This is one of those observations that seems simple but opens up into something larger. Shame is learned. It's cultural. A deer doesn't feel exposed. Neither does Belogoraka. The shame we feel about our bodies, about basic physical needs, about survival necessities, these aren't natural human traits. They're things civilization teaches us. I remember being in a Russian banya for the first time as a kid. Public bathing, everyone naked, multiple generations. The older women were completely comfortable in their bodies in a way that seemed impossible. No performance, no shame, no self-consciousness. Just bodies being bodies. That's what Bulychev is describing here. Belogoraka exists before that shame got constructed. Then there's a small exchange that reveals something about time. Andrei asks Belogoraka how old she is. She doesn't know. More than that, she doesn't understand why he's asking. You people of the Sky Tribe always want to know how many minutes, hours, days. Why? Think about how completely we're embedded in measured time. We check clocks constantly. We know our age in years, sometimes down to months and days. We talk about how long things take, how much time we have, whether we're wasting time or using it well. But this obsession with measuring time isn't natural. It's something certain kinds of civilization create. Belogoraka lives in what we might call natural time. Day and night. Seasons. Hunger and fullness. Tired and rested. She doesn't need to know her numerical age because that number doesn't mean anything in how she lives. The question itself reveals the gap between their worlds. When she returns from finding food, Andrei has a moment of seeing her completely differently. The sun is behind her, creating a kind of halo effect. And he thinks she was a fairy of this cheerful forest. He'd been traveling with her, depending on her, but suddenly he actually sees her. Not as a primitive guide or a survival asset, but as herself. We do this with people. We think we see them because we recognize their face, we know their role in our life. But actually seeing someone is different. It's a shift in perception where suddenly the other person becomes vivid and real in a way they weren't before. Usually it happens in unexpected moments. A certain light. A gesture. Something that breaks through our habitual way of looking. Belogoraka tells Andrei simply, "I am your woman." In English this might sound romantic or possessive. But the context is different. She has betrayed her entire tribe to save him. She has risked everything. In her culture, this declaration carries weight beyond romance. She has made him hers through actions. She saved his life, which means his life belongs to her now in some fundamental way. And by saving him, she has bound herself to him because her tribe will suffer consequences. Later she explains calmly what will happen to her tribe. The enemy will come. They will torture her people to find out where Andrei went. They will beat them. But they won't kill them unnecessarily. Why kill for no reason, she says. Violence in her world is purposeful and calculated. You hurt people to get information, to establish dominance, to take resources. But random killing would be wasteful. This is brutal but logical. And then she says something that catches Andrei off guard. She knows their enemy probably already knows they've escaped. But she says, it's more cheerful to think he doesn't know yet and will be angry. She's consciously choosing a more pleasant interpretation of reality even though she knows it's probably false. This is hope as a psychological survival mechanism. Not blind optimism, but deliberate self-delusion because it makes the present moment more bearable. She knows the truth. She's choosing not to fully believe it because belief would make walking forward harder. Andrei keeps trying to understand why she saved him. Was it love? Tribal politics? Instinct? Religious obligation? The narrator says, understanding that you can't judge Bela Guraka by Earth standards, Andrei still tried to find a rational explanation for everything. He knows his framework doesn't apply. He knows he's looking at her behavior through the wrong lens. But he can't help trying to translate her actions into something that makes sense to him. This is what we do with anyone sufficiently different from us. We know intellectually that their logic is different. But we still try to map their behavior onto our own motivations because it's the only tool we have. Andrei is humble enough to recognize this is a limitation, but honest enough to admit he can't overcome it. And there's a reversal happening here that Bulychev is careful to show. Andrei is from an advanced civilization. He has technology, education, presumably centuries of accumulated knowledge. But right now he is completely dependent on this primitive girl. She is keeping him alive. He cannot afford to condescend to her or reject her when she's the only thing standing between him and death in this wilderness. The power dynamic has shifted. The advanced spaceman needs the primitive guide. And this changes how he can see her, what he can afford to think about her. At one point he touches his head and jerks his hand back in shock. He'd forgotten they cut his hair in the local style. And he thinks about how he'll look appearing at the center like this. His concern is about identity markers. The haircut means he looks like one of them now instead of like himself. When you lose the external markers of your identity, who are you? So here's what happens when you sit hungry and betrayed in the dark, watching someone you trusted feast with your enemies. Andrei sees Bela Guraka through a gap in the rocks. She's eating. Not picking at scraps like a prisoner, but actually eating, sitting with the nomads around their fire. And something breaks in him. Not loudly. Quietly. The way ice cracks under weight you can't see. He'd been waiting for her. Starving. His feet wrapped in improvised sandals made from wood and vines because he'd cut them on rocks. His whole body aching. And he'd believed in her. He'd constructed this entire narrative in his head about loyalty and connection and how they were in this together. The book says it like this? Why did I decide she should live by the same laws as me? Between us are thousands of years and billions of kilometers. That's the moment. That's when Andrei stops being naive. He realizes he'd been projecting his entire moral framework onto someone who had no reason to adopt it. She saved him before because it was useful. She's feasting now because that's useful. There's no betrayal because there was never the kind of bond he imagined. He invented it. I think about this a lot in my own life. How often we create stories about other people's motivations that make sense to us, that fit our understanding of how relationships should work. And then we're shocked, genuinely shocked, when they act according to completely different logic. It's not that they're evil. It's that they're operating from a different set of premises we never actually verified. Andrei was so hungry he'd competed with a dog for a bone. The book describes this moment with brutal clarity. The dog sensed in Andrei a rival and growled threateningly, pressing the bone with her paw. A starving man and a starving dog recognize each other as competitors for the same resource. When you're reduced to that level of need, social categories dissolve. You're not a human and an animal anymore. You're just two hungry beings. But he'd told himself a story. That he was enduring this for a reason. That waiting would be rewarded. That Bela Guraka would return and they'd continue their partnership. He built an entire emotional structure on this foundation. And now he watches it collapse. The book has this line. It was advantageous for her to save me. Now it's more advantageous to feast with the Khan. That's it. That's the whole relationship reduced to its actual components. Transactional. Not malicious. Just practical. This is what Bulychev does that I find so piercing. He doesn't make Belogorodka evil. He doesn't make Andrei stupid. He just shows what happens when two people from genuinely different worlds try to navigate together, and how the more powerful person in that equation is usually the one who expects less, who knows survival doesn't care about loyalty. But the story doesn't end there. Because Andrei doesn't just sit in despair. His feet are destroyed, swollen and numb, and the book makes this observation. His ankles and feet swelled and almost lost sensitivity. It's actually better this way. That's such a dark, honest thing to notice. Sometimes numbness is an improvement. Sometimes the absence of feeling is preferable to constant pain. Your body gives up on sending distress signals because what's the point? You're not going to stop walking. You're not going to rest properly. So it just stops telling you how bad things are. And there's relief in that. I remember reading this section and thinking about all the times in life when you develop emotional numbness the same way. Not because you're strong, but because continuous pain becomes unsustainable. Your system finds a way to keep functioning by just reducing the sensitivity of the sensors. It's a survival mechanism that feels like wisdom but is actually just damage. Andrei decides to find the witch's dungeon and trance himself. And here's where his engineering background becomes crucial. He thinks, if he, Andrei Bruce, wanted to hide an entrance to his dungeon, he would make it indistinguishable from the rest of the floor. This is empathetic engineering. You solve the problem by inhabiting the mind of whoever created it. You ask, if I were them, with their constraints and their goals, what would I do? It's not about supernatural insight. It's about understanding logic and incentives. The witches need a hidden entrance. They need it to be accessible but invisible. So where would that be? What would it look like? He searches methodically. And he finds it. Because once you understand the constraints, the solution often becomes obvious. And this is something I've found true in completely non-technical contexts. When you're trying to understand why someone did something that seems inexplicable, you often just need to understand their constraints. What were they optimizing for? What did they need to hide, or protect, or accomplish? Andrei goes down into the dungeon. And what he finds there explodes everything he thought he understood about this planet. He expected primitive darkness. Stone chambers. Maybe bones. The stuff of witches in fairy tales. Instead, he finds a museum. An actual, advanced, perfectly preserved museum with specimens from dozens of geological periods. The book says, least of all did Andrei expect to find such a museum in the witch's dwelling, and it was irritating because it didn't fit the concept. That line gets me. It was irritating. Not terrifying. Not fascinating. Irritating. Because he'd built a mental model of what this world was, and now he has to rebuild it entirely. That's exhausting. It would almost be easier if he'd found what he expected. What Andrei discovers is that this planet isn't naturally occurring chaos. It's not an evolutionary paradox that happened by accident. It's artificial. Some advanced civilization, created this place as a kind of living museum where creatures from different epochs could be preserved and observed. The witches aren't primitive magic users. They're the degraded descendants of whoever was left to maintain this place. They're operating technology they no longer understand, performing rituals around machinery whose purpose they've forgotten. This recontextualizes everything. The evolutionary paradox isn't a mystery to solve. It's an engineering project. The coexistence of stegosaurs and mammoths isn't impossible. It's designed. And the witches aren't the enemy. They're just people, probably as confused as everyone else, trying to maintain systems they inherited without understanding them. One of the witches is down there. Andrei sees her working, and the book describes something that chills him. There was something sinister in the witch's businesslike manner. She's not being dramatic or magical or threatening. She's just doing her job. Efficiently. Routinely. Like someone working in any mundane occupation. That's what's frightening. Not theatrical evil. Not malice. Just the casual efficiency of someone performing a task they've done many times before. Because that implies an entire system. It suggests that whatever terrible things happen here, they happen regularly enough to become routine. And the witch looks strange to Andre. Her face has rat-like features. The lower part slopes toward her nose. The book says he almost wants to check if she has a tail. This is what fear does. It makes us see others as less than human. As animals. It's a psychological defense mechanism. If they're not quite human, if they're more like rats or monsters, then whatever conflict we have with them feels more justified. But Andre knows better now. She's not a monster. She's a person working in a museum she doesn't fully understand, maintaining systems that were built by someone else, in a place that has become something very different from what it was designed to be. And somewhere above him, Beliguraka is still feasting. And his feet are still numb. And he's still alone. But at least now he understands the world he's in. Not the story he wanted it to be. The one that actually exists. There's a moment in the museum when Andre finds Jean. Not Jean alive. Jean preserved in a glass cylinder, naked, floating in some liquid that keeps him looking as fresh as the day he died. And the text describes this with such brutal precision. It says his death was grief. But his position in a jar on display was humiliating. The nakedness of a very civilized man who didn't exercise much was immodest. I need you to understand what this does. Because finding a friend dead is one kind of horror. Finding a friend dead and displayed like a butterfly pinned to cardboard is something else entirely. It strips away not just life but dignity. It reduces a person who had thoughts and jokes and memories of someone named Ingrid who loved the night more than the day, it reduces all of that to a specimen. An object. Something to be catalogued and filed. And this is where the book stops being about adventure and becomes about something much darker. The witches, these figures who've been demanding human sacrifices for generations, they're not supernatural beings. They're scientists. Or what's left of scientists. The museum wasn't built by the current witches. It was built by whoever came to this planet originally, those beings powerful enough to pierce mountains with a sword. But those original creators are gone. What's left are the maintainers. The robots. The system's still running according to their programming. The text reveals this: the museum owners never left this planet. They continued to add to it, either hiding deep underground or pretending to be witches. That's why the witches demanded human sacrifices. They needed specimens. Let that settle for a second. Every person thrown to the sharks. Every tribal prisoner handed over to the witches. Every sacrifice made in terror and superstition. They were all just specimen collection. The maintainers of the museum needed to keep it updated, needed to add new examples, and they found the most efficient method. Make the locals afraid of you. Make them call you witches. Let them develop a whole mythology around you. Then they'll bring you specimens willingly. This is where Bulychev does something really sophisticated with the horror. Because the witches, these robot maintainers, they have what they consider to be a moral framework. They tell Jean directly, they don't kill anyone. They're real scientists, experimenters. They're building a museum, they're not harming anyone. They only take on loan those who are already condemned to die by step law anyway. And the text makes this comparison explicit. It says, remember how the Inquisition worked? The criminal is handed over to the secular authorities. That's the mechanism of moral distance. The Inquisition could say their hands were clean because they didn't actually burn anyone. They just determined heresy and handed the heretic over. Someone else lit the fire. The witches used the same logic. The tribes condemned their criminals. The witches just collect those already condemned. They're not killing. They're just preserving what would die anyway. Except of course they're creating demand for that death. The tribes know the witches want sacrifices. So there's pressure to provide them. The whole system corrupts the culture it touches. Just like the Inquisition created demand for finding heretics because the institution needed to justify itself. I think about this whenever I hear someone say they're just following procedure. Just doing their job. Just following the rules someone else made. There's always this gap between the person who decides and the person who executes. And that gap is where responsibility goes to die. But here's where it gets even stranger. The witches don't just preserve Jean's body. They create something else. They make, and the book uses this phrase, 1,000,000 holograms in layers of his body. Everything coded down to the last cell. A perfect monument to him. Tomorrow morning they'll hand him to the sorcerer, and his warriors will throw him to a shark. He'll die. But they'll have an exact copy. Jean sees this copy. Sees himself floating in that cylinder. And his reaction is so perfectly human it almost made me laugh the first time I read it. He says, "Well, don't I look stupid? Do you have some kind of cloth to cover the groin?" Very indecent. He's looking at his own corpse, his own perfect replica, and he's embarrassed about the nudity. Not terrified. Not philosophical. Embarrassed. Like he walked in on himself in the bathroom. The text adds, this was only from the outside. His own splitting? Jean wasn't surprised. And I think that's the most disturbing thing in this entire section. Jean isn't surprised to see himself dead. He's already processed it. Already accepted it. The horror has moved past shock into something like apathy. The same apathy that hits Andrei earlier. The text describes it, Andrei couldn't make himself be afraid. Apathy had taken hold of him, crashed down on him when he saw what remained of Jean. When the horror is too big, the mind just shuts down. Goes numb. It's a defense mechanism. Like when you hear about a disaster with thousands dead versus hearing about one person's death. The thousands become abstract. The one person stays real. But if that one person is your friend, and you see them floating in a jar like a pickled vegetable, your brain can't process it as real. So it stops trying. Jean is walking around waiting to die, and he's already mourned himself. He's on the other side of his own death, just waiting for his body to catch up. And throughout all this, he keeps his analytical mind working. He notices things. Like how the witches speak. The text says, you can catch an accent when they talk here. It was their language, but only the mouth spoke, the face didn't participate in it. That's not normal. Only the mouth moving. The rest of the face static. Like a mask with a moving mouth hole. Jean picks up on this because he's good with languages, and language isn't just words. It's expression. Gesture. The way your eyes crinkle when you smile while saying something ironic. The way your forehead moves when you ask a question. The witches have none of that. They have correct grammar and vocabulary. But no human connection to what they're saying. Later, one of the witches' robes opens. Jean expects to see an old woman's body and is ready to look away. Instead, he sees a panel. Machinery. The text just adds this dry line, eternal rest to you, grandmother. The grandmother was never alive. Never human. Just a robot shaped like a witch, shaped like the local idea of what a powerful magical woman should look like. Layers of disguise. Technology pretending to be mysticism, pretending to be an old woman. And the technology is sophisticated about this disguise. The museum has lights that are cleverly made to look like torches. The museum owners didn't want a savage who got inside to sense something wrong. They thought about what a tribal person would expect to see and designed everything to match those expectations. The advanced technology hides inside the aesthetic of the primitive. I see this in our world too. User interfaces designed to look like physical objects. The trash can on your computer desktop. The folder that looks like a manila folder. We wrap the complex in familiar images so people don't feel lost. But there's something darker possible with that same technique. Making surveillance look friendly. Making control look like convenience. Making exploitation look like opportunity. Gene experiences this inversion of expectations in another way. He says, "It would be more understandable to me if they danced around me, cast spells, did shamanic rituals. But they conducted a physiological examination. The savage ritual would make sense to him. Frightening, but comprehensible. Instead, he gets clinical examination. Scientific procedure. And somehow that's worse. Because ritual has meaning, even if it's brutal. But being studied like a lab rat, that denies your humanity more completely. You're not even an enemy. You're data." The book keeps circling back to this theme. Understanding. Misunderstanding. The text calls it humanity's main enemy. Says that no computer in the galaxy can answer questions that cannot be formulated. Some gaps between minds are so complete that you can't even figure out what question to ask to bridge them. And even when you think you understand, the book says, you only understand at one level. You fight for that understanding only so that around the next turn you see a person standing on their head. Each answer reveals how much more there is that doesn't make sense. Andre explains the whole thing to Gene. They're sitting in that underground base, surrounded by alien technology pretending to be a dungeon, and Andre tells him what the strangers from the sky were actually doing. They took a planet where life was just beginning, just taking its first steps, and they accelerated evolution. They compressed millions of years into decades. The book says it plainly, they took a planet on which life was only making its first steps, and began to drive evolution at breakneck speeds. They squeezed millions of years into years. Think about that. Not just breeding faster horses or selecting better crops. Taking an entire world and pushing the fast-forward button on all of life. Andre explains the logic. The more capabilities a civilization has, the bigger and longer their experiments become. If you only have 10 years to live, you do 10-year experiments. If your civilization spans millennia, you do experiments that take millennia. He mentions his grandfather, a scientist who wanted to understand the Stone Age. Not by reading about it, not by looking at artifacts in museums. By living it. He and his students manufactured Stone Age tools and chopped down trees with stone axes, traveled in dugout canoes and plowed the earth with wooden plows. The old man understood something important. To really know how something worked, you have to do it with your own hands. That's what these aliens were doing, but on a planetary scale. They wanted to understand evolution, so they recreated it. They watched it happen. Guided it, shaped it, accelerated it. And then it killed them. Gene makes the comparison. Frankenstein's monster. The creation that destroys its creator. Andre corrects him, and this correction matters. Gene says it's dangerous to be a god. Andre says no, it's dangerous to consider yourself a god. The difference is everything. It's not power that kills you. It's thinking you've mastered something you haven't. The aliens made one huge miscalculation. They could speed up genetic evolution. They watched species develop, intelligence emerge, tools appear. That part worked. But then they assumed social evolution followed the same rules. They thought, we accelerated their biology, now we'll accelerate their civilization. We'll give them technology, and they'll progress faster. The book puts it simply, they continued to rush evolution, believing that social progress could be accelerated in the same way as genetic progress. They gave advanced weapons to people who weren't ready for them morally. Not intellectually, the humans were smart enough to use the weapons. But they hadn't developed the social structures, the ethical frameworks, the cultural safeguards that make such power safe to handle. Andre and Gene find the evidence. A warehouse full of arrowheads. Thousands of them. Metal arrowheads, precisely made. They were stamped, but the stamp carefully imitated the unevenness of hand forging. Mass production disguised as primitive craftswork. The aliens were running a factory, churning out weapons that looked like they came from Stone Age workshops, distributing them to tribes who were supposed to use them to advance. Instead, one of those tribes, led by a man named Octian Hash, used the weapons to kill the aliens themselves. Andre explains, Octian Hash gained experience communicating with the strangers from the sky. He tasted their blood, and that doomed our comrades. Once you've killed a god, other gods stop seeming invincible. The psychological barrier breaks. The aliens who gave Octian Hash his first weapons taught him they could bleed. Then he killed the next ones who came. Jean looks around at the ruins of this massive project, all the technology, the decades or centuries of work, and says it's just sad. What effort, and all for nothing. I think about this in smaller contexts. How many business projects collapse right before completion because someone miscalculated human nature? How many reform movements fail because they give people tools without building the culture to use them wisely? You can't just drop new technology or new ideas into a society and expect smooth progress. The human part, the trust, the ethics, the social agreements, that takes longer to build than any machine. Andre describes Octian Hash with brutal clarity. This is a wild boy. They held out a candy to him, and he bit off the hand offering it. Not out of evil, exactly. Out of greed and impatience. He wanted more, wanted it faster, and saw his benefactors as obstacles rather than allies. Then the conversation turns darker. They're trapped in this prehistoric world, their colleagues are dead, and they need to figure out what to do. Andre says something that stops Jean cold. So what, surrender to Octian Hash? And Andre answers, seriously, that's an option. Just considering it feels like betrayal. But Andre isn't being cynical. He's being rational. They're stuck thousands of years in the past with no backup, no weapons, and an enemy who has already killed people with far more resources than they have. Surrender isn't heroic, but it might be the only way to stay alive. Then Jean says a name. Belagyuraka. And the book does something subtle here that I missed the first time I read it. It describes what happens in Andre's mind, and when that name was spoken nearby, by another person, Belagyuraka returned. Just a moment ago she wasn't there. She had been expelled from memory. Andre had unconsciously erased her from his thoughts. Not deliberately, not as a decision. His mind did it automatically because thinking about her made it impossible to function. You do this during crisis. Your brain protects you by compartmentalizing, by pushing away the things that would break you if you looked at them directly. You deal with the immediate problem. Everything else goes into a locked room. But then someone says the name out loud, and the door opens. Andre doesn't want to tell Jean what he saw. That he spotted Belagyuraka in Octian Hash's tent. The book says, as if talking about it was shameful. Not her shame, his. There's something about witnessing someone in a compromised position that creates a secondary humiliation. You feel like you violated their dignity just by seeing it. Jean figures it out anyway. He says, matter of fact, well, she's the chief's daughter. Meaning Octian Hash will take her as a wife. He says it like it's obvious, like it's just how these things work. And in that culture, at that time, it probably is. This is where cultural relativism stops being an abstract philosophy discussion and becomes real. You're confronted with something that violates every value you hold, and you have to accept it because you're powerless to change it, and it's not even unusual within its own context. But they still have to deal with Octian Hash. He's not going away just because they find him morally repugnant. And here's what's uncomfortable, the book makes clear that he's smart. Really smart. The narrative voice says, it's pleasant to be smarter than your opponent. But Octian Hash was again smarter than the strangers. He keeps outthinking them. Predicting their moves. Staying one step ahead. The book doesn't make him stupid or purely evil. It makes him a capable strategist who happens to be their enemy. That's harder to deal with than a simple villain. When they finally confront him, Octian Hash explains his logic. He didn't want to kill anyone, he says. I didn't want to kill your people, but I need weapons. He has a bigger war to fight, a rival tribe to conquer. The aliens were just a means to an end. I would have scared you, then said, go home and bring lots of iron to the great chief. He sees violence as a negotiation tool. Not personal. Not emotional. Just leverage. You threaten, you demonstrate capability, you extract concessions. It's business. Jean understands the necessity of dealing with him but says, I understand. But it's still disgusting. That's the position they're in. Swallowing their revulsion because survival requires it. Making the morally uncomfortable choice because the alternative is death. Andre even points out the small comfort available: victors don't poison the defeated. They just dance on their bones. Meaning Octi and Hash won't bother poisoning their food because he's already won and he needs them alive for trade. And then Jean says something that catches even him by surprise. He admits that despite everything, despite losing colleagues, despite being stranded, despite watching Bela Guraka taken by their enemy, he feels happy. I should be grieving for my comrades right now, worrying about whether we'll manage to return to our people. But I'm simply happy. Human emotions don't follow logical rules. You can be genuinely happy while terrible things are happening around you. The guilt comes from the disconnect. You think you should feel one thing, and you feel another, and then you feel bad about feeling good. The book doesn't judge this. It just names it. So here's what happens when you have to let something go that you can't even fully explain to yourself why you want to hold on to. Andre is standing at that moment we've all had. Not the dramatic movie version, but the real one. Where you know the smart choice, the logical choice, the choice everyone would agree with, and you just can't make yourself do it. The pilot is ready. The ship is there. 5 hours, that's what he promised. He can go back now, leave this planet, leave the mud and the violence and the impossible task of negotiating with alien warlords. Leave Bela Guraka to her world. He watches her lead the horses away. She's doing that thing people do when they're trying to be strong, walking with her back too straight, not looking back. And the navigator, this older guy who's probably seen 100 planets, he says something that cuts right through. He says, what would Bela Guraka do in the city? Her place is here. You can't pull a fish out of water, even if you could give it a house on land. And Andre knows this is true. He knows it. But here's what the navigator doesn't say, what Andre realizes on his own, and tomorrow Bela Guraka will go hunting or run into warriors from another tribe. And he, Andre, will tomorrow be riding mentally next to Bela Guraka, waiting for the bushes to part and for a saber-toothed tiger to leap at her. This is what leaving means. Not clean separation. Not moving on. It means carrying someone in your head every day, imagining every danger, every threat, every moment you're not there. It means a permanent partition between you and everyone else in your world, because part of you is always somewhere else. I've seen this in my own life, watching humans make decisions. The person who leaves their hometown for a better job but spends every phone call worrying about their aging parent. The parent who sends their kid to a good school far away and then can't concentrate at work imagining all the things that could go wrong. The clean break that isn't clean at all. So Andre orders the pilot to turn back. Just says back, and when the pilot asks why, he says nothing. Because how do you explain this? Bulychev writes, he said nothing more, because if he said one more word he'd have to explain, and explaining all this was impossible. Some decisions live outside the territory of rational explanation. You can list reasons afterward, construct justifications, but in the moment of choosing, there's just this recognition that you can't leave, and the reasons why don't fit into words people would understand. When he gets back to Bela Guraka, she's struggling with the horses on a narrow path. Typical Andre, he makes it casual, asks if she needs help. She immediately bristles. I could handle the horses without you. Maybe there wasn't enough room in that flying machine, she asks. Maybe. I thought maybe you were worried about me. We don't answer provocative questions. This is how people talk when they care about each other but can't afford to say it directly. Every culture has this dance. The factory worker who brings extra lunch because I made too much, not because I noticed you've been skipping meals. The neighbor who just happens to be fixing their fence on the day you're doing heavy lifting. I was going to do this anyway. Pride is expensive. We pay for it in connection. But then Andrei does something that surprises even himself. He suggests she could come with him. Take her sister along, maybe things would work out. And Bella Garaka, in her completely unfiltered way, says, I'd be happy. And then I'd kill my sister. Just like that. Pure honesty. No civilization smoothing it over. She'd be happy to have her sister as an alternative for him, and she'd also be consumed by jealousy and murder her. Both things true at the same time. No pretense. No social performance. There's something almost refreshing about it. In Andrei's world, people would have the same feeling but hide it under layers of acceptable speech. They'd say, I don't think that arrangement would work for me emotionally, or I need to process my feelings about that. Bella Garaka just states the direct truth, happiness, then murder. Jean makes this observation earlier that stays with me. After one of these cultural clashes, he says basically that every time civilization meets wildness, wildness wins. Not because wildness is better, but because it's more direct, more immediate, less burdened by complexity. Andrei feels this constantly. He keeps getting outmaneuvered by people with stone tools because they're working with simpler frameworks. He overthinks. They react. He considers consequences. They act on feeling. It's not that they're smarter, they're just not carrying the weight of thinking 17 steps ahead. And this connects to something Bulychev is doing throughout this whole novel. He's asking, what's the relationship between technological advancement and human wisdom? The aliens thought you could accelerate one and get the other. Speed up evolution, give people tools, and they'll become enlightened. But that's not how it works. You can give someone a gun without giving them the judgment about when not to use it. You can give someone power without giving them the restraint that makes power safe. Andrei has better weapons now. The narration says he's stronger than anyone on the planet, though that didn't save Conrad. Technology doesn't solve human problems. It just makes them faster and louder. What Andrei is facing is something all of us face when we care about someone in a dangerous situation. You can't protect them by worrying. You can't keep them safe from another city by imagining all the threats. But you also can't stop yourself from trying. So you have two choices: leave and torture yourself with distance, or stay and face the danger together. Neither choice is good. Neither choice is safe. This is the reality of loving anything in an uncertain world, and every world is uncertain. You just choose which version of fear you can live with. Bulychev doesn't tell us exactly what happens next. The book moves to other threads. But we understand Andrei has made his choice. Not the logical choice. Not the choice he could defend in a report. The choice that lets him sleep at night, even if the nights are more dangerous. I think about this with every decision that involves people instead of just problems. The job that pays better but means leaving behind the team that understands you. The relationship that makes sense on paper versus the one that makes no sense but feels right. The safe path versus the path where someone needs you. There's no formula. No algorithm. You just have to know yourself well enough to recognize which fears you can live with and which ones will eat you from the inside. Bulychev wrote this in the Soviet Union, a place that officially believed in rational planning, in scientific solutions to human problems, in the perfectibility of society through correct thinking. And he kept writing these stories about people making irrational choices, acting on feeling, doing things that made no logical sense but perfect human sense. Maybe that was the quietest rebellion. Not arguing against the system directly. Just showing, again and again, that humans don't work the way the planners think they should. That we're not rational actors. That we're creatures who will turn a ship around to help someone lead horses through dangerous territory, and we can't even explain why. What's a choice you made that you couldn't fully explain to anyone, but you knew you had to make? Leo. T810 Explorer. By Alpha Ross.